Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, January 22nd, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the U.S. prepares for an open-ended war against the Houthis in Yemen. So U.S. officials told the Washington Post on Saturday that the Biden administration is planning for a sustained military campaign against the Houthis in Yemen. And they're planning this even as there's been all these airstrikes, missile strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. Over the weekend, they bombed Yemen 2 more times. So they've launched these strikes 7 times since Friday, January 12th. And this has done nothing to deter the Houthis. It's only dramatically escalated the situation, and they're planning to do more and more. So these officials who spoke with the Washington Post could not put any timeline on how long the conflict will last. They said that they don't expect it to last for years. That this is what they told the Washington Post. Oh, we don't think it's going to last years like those wars in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. But, I mean, what kind of estimate is that? And they also acknowledge that they cannot identify an end date or provide an estimate for when the Yemenis' military capability will be adequately diminished. Some U.S. officials are worried that the plans for an open-ended conflict against the Houthis will shatter the fragile truce between warring factions in Yemen, which includes a U.S.-backed the Saudi-UAE coalition that fought a war against the Houthis from 2015 until 2022 when they reached a ceasefire in April of 2022. Now, there has still been some fighting on the ground, but the big thing with that ceasefire is that there's been no Saudi airstrikes in Yemen and no Houthi attacks inside Saudi Arabia or inside the UAE. And I saw some reports of Saudi shelling in North Yemen over the weekend. That is something I know that has happened during the ceasefire, is some limited fighting on the ground and some shelling in the north across the border. I haven't seen any indication yet that means that the Saudis are restarting their war against the Houthis, but we'll see. So far, it seems like they're distancing themselves from what the U.S. is doing. And now, again, so the U.S. has bombed Yemen 7 times now since January 12th, and there was a Bloomberg report on Friday that said the U.S. and the U.K. were exploring ways to step up the campaign against the Houthis, signaling that these strikes are going to intensify even more. And remember that last week, that quote from Biden, I'm just going to read it again because it's really unbelievable. He was asked by a reporter if the strikes on the Houthis were working, and his response was, quote, "Well, when you say working, are they stopping the Houthis? No. Are they going to continue? Yes," end quote. So this is what they're escalating. This is the attitude that they're going in with this. Well, it's not really working. We don't know how long this thing's going to last, but let's just go full steam ahead here. All right, so the next one, lawmakers push funding to replace weapons used in Yemen. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. As the White House has started an open-ended and unauthorized war in Yemen, some members of Congress are pushing for legislation that would provide funding to replace the munitions dropped on the Middle East's poorest nation. So Politico reports that lawmakers, members of Congress, lobbyists, and the Navy are angling to use a multi-billion-dollar national security supplemental to replenish the military's inventory of munitions. So all these multi-million-dollar missiles that the U.S. is using to shoot, that the U.S. has used to shoot down Houthi drones, that they've used to bomb Yemen with now. They've probably fired hundreds at Yemen at this point. They cost a lot of money, and now they're saying, let's spend more money, on this war. And essentially what they're trying to do here is, if you remember, President Biden requested over $100 billion in what they call an emergency supplemental funding package. And that includes military aid for Ukraine, military aid for Israel, and for Taiwan. And then there's some border spending in there. So it seems like they want to add this into the mix. I mean, there's definitely money to be made here for some people. it just goes to show how it doesn't matter, if they don't really technically have the money to spend on this, let's just pass another, so-called emergency spending bill here. So I'm sure this idea is going to gain some popularity. That $100 billion bill still hasn't been passed. The Republicans are still holding out on a border deal. I saw Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, recently saying, again, once we get this deal on border, we will pass that Ukraine aid. We got to keep sticking it to Putin. He's really bad on Ukraine. So I think Biden is going to get that money eventually. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. military says that the 2 U.S. Navy SEALs missing off the coast of Somalia are dead. So the U.S. military declared on Sunday that 2 U.S. Navy SEALs who went missing in the Arabian Sea off the coast of Somalia are dead. The SEALs went missing while boarding a boat carrying weapons allegedly bound for the Houthis in Yemen, and this really makes them the first American casualties of President Biden's new war against the Houthis. The SEALs went missing on January 11th. I believe it was late in the day, and so the first round of strikes that the U.S. and the U.K. launched in Yemen, that was on the January 12th, but very early in the morning. It was Thursday, still Thursday here, but it was early Friday morning in Yemen, and I believe this happened like Thursday night. So the story, the U.S. military's stories, I know some people don't believe this story, but this is what the U.S. military is saying, is that one of the SEALs fell into the water while trying to board the boat, and that another one jumped after him. And it was due to rough seas. U.S. military officials told CNN that there was 8-foot swells that night. So they searched for 10 days, and they could not locate them, so their status has been changed to deceased. And these are not the first American troops to die since October 7th. If you remember back in November, 5 U.S. Army Special Operations soldiers who were deployed to the region to back Israel, they were deployed after October 7th, they died in a helicopter crash off Cyprus. And the Pentagon said that they were on a refueling training mission. I know some people don't believe that story either, but that's what the Pentagon is saying. So the next story here, U.S. troops injured in a heavy rocket attack on a U.S. base in Iraq. So U.S. troops were injured in a heavy missile and rocket attack on the Ain al-Assad air base on Saturday as U.S. forces continue to come under attack due to President Biden's support for Israel's slaughter in Gaza. According to U.S. Central Command, multiple ballistic missiles and rockets were launched at the base, and most were intercepted while some impacted the base. CENTCOM said that a number of U.S. personnel were being examined for traumatic brain injuries, and one Iraqi soldier was wounded in the attack. So they're not saying exactly how many U.S. troops were wounded or injured in this thing, but this is, dozens of American soldiers have been injured, basically for Israel. That's why these attacks on the U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria started in mid-October over Biden's support for what Israel's doing in Gaza. And they're basically just sitting ducks at these bases. It's only a matter of time before an American is killed in one of these attacks. And they portray these deployments. They're sending I believe the New Jersey National Guard for a deployment over there, and they portray it as a fight against ISIS, but really they're going over there to potentially die for Israel. CENTCOM blamed this attack on Iranian-backed militias, which refers to the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. According to al-Mayadeen, the Islamic resistance in Iraq took credit for the attack. According to the Pentagon, U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria have come under attack 140 times since mid-October. The U.S. has launched several rounds of airstrikes in both countries in response, including a drone strike in Baghdad that killed a deputy commander of the Popular Mobilization Forces, a coalition of Iraqi militias that's part of the Iraqi security forces. So we know that the Iraqi government of Prime Minister Shia al-Sudani is saying that they want the U.S. to leave. They want the international coalition to leave. The U.S. doesn't look interested in leaving, and they do have ways to really hurt the Iraqi economy. Basically, they're holding the country hostage. And they're still sending Americans there, for no reason other than to push back against Iran in Iraq and just be there for Israel in the region. All right, so the next one here, Israel is nowhere close to eliminating Hamas. So U.S. intelligence officials estimate that Israel is nowhere close to its goal of eliminating Hamas after over 3 months of relentless airstrikes and ground operations in Gaza. This was reported by the Wall Street Journal. According to these estimates from U.S. intel agencies, between 20 and 30% of Hamas fighters have been killed, and the U.S. estimates that the group has 25,000 to 30,000 militants and a few thousand police and other types of forces. There are also other militant groups inside Gaza, including Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So this is just the U.S. estimate. Really, there's no way to confirm if this is right, but I think the important thing here is that these officials, U.S. intelligence officials, are saying, Netanyahu saying he wants to eradicate Hamas, and they're just nowhere near doing anything like that. And this report came, there's some dissent within the Israeli war cabinet. Gadi Eisenkot, who is a former head of the IDF, he's I forget the name of his political party now, but anyway, he's a minister in the war cabinet. And he suggested that the goal of eradicating Hamas is unrealistic, and he took a swipe at Netanyahu. He said, quote, "Whoever speaks of the absolute defeat of Hamas in Gaza and of it no longer having the will or the capability to harm Israel is not speaking the truth. That is why we should not tell tall tales. Today, the situation already in the Gaza Strip is that the goals of the war have not yet been achieved, but the war is already not happening. There is a reduced troop deployment, a different modus operandi," end quote. So this Wall Street Journal report, and I've seen other reports say this, that Hamas is reestablishing its police force and other types of forces in some areas in northern Gaza where the Israeli military had withdrawn troops despite the massive destruction to those areas. And this really shows kind of the resilience of Hamas's forces, that Israel obliterated these areas, went in there with ground troops, and cleared the area, and then they left, and Hamas is showing back up. And Israel has claimed that it's killed 9,000 Hamas fighters. Again, no way to really know. Hamas has not been putting out casualty numbers, and they are denying that they're taking heavy losses. So basically, the 9,000 Hamas fighters killed is on the higher end of the U.S. intelligence estimate. And then another important point here is that, even if they're taking out thousands of Hamas fighters, you got to figure a lot of people are joining either Hamas, another militant group, or just getting their hands on a rifle and going to fight Israeli soldiers because of what Israel is doing in Gaza. I mean, they're totally destroying the place. And what's interesting is that top U.S. military officials have said this. General Charles Q. Brown, he's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking U.S. military officer. He has warned that killing so many civilians in Gaza will help Hamas recruit. And then when it comes to the numbers from Gaza's health ministry, they say the death toll has surpassed 25,000, which includes 9,600 children and 6,750 women. 8,000 people are missing and presumed to be dead or dying under the rubble. So they don't differentiate, when it comes to the men that are killed between Hamas fighters and civilians, but only about 35% of the dead are men. And it's unclear if the ministry is recording every Hamas death. Many of them could be killed underground or in the areas that have been evacuated and might not be recorded as part of the death toll. All right, so the next one here, Israeli commanders say that this diplomacy is the only way to free Israeli hostages. So this is another interesting one. So 4 senior Israeli military leaders told the New York Times that they've concluded the only way to secure the release of the over 100 Israeli hostages in Gaza is through diplomacy, not military action. The commanders who spoke on the condition of anonymity told the paper that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's goal of eradicating Hamas is incompatible with rescuing the hostages. Israel has only done limited damage to Hamas, and the commanders said that a drawn-out battle would likely kill the Israeli hostages who were believed to be held in Hamas's tunnel network, which is far more expansive than Israeli officials initially thought. So according to this report, before they invaded Gaza, before the ground invasion, Israeli officials thought Hamas had 100 miles of tunnels underneath Gaza, that's a lot of tunnels, considering the Gaza Strip, I believe, is about, 28 miles long. But now they believe there's 450 miles of tunnels, different levels to them. So it's a very vast and complex tunnel system under. And that's part of the reason why you see the Hamas fighters showing up, popping up again in North Gaza, in Gaza City, where the U.S. troops have, not the U.S. troops, where the Israeli troops have withdrawn from. So this report said that Israel was planning to take operational control of Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and Rafah by the end of December, but Israeli forces now only control some portions of Khan Yunis and have not yet launched an invasion of Rafah. Hamas forces are also reasserting their presence in areas of Gaza City that Israeli troops have left. This map is from South Front, and according to their tracking of everything, the area highlighted in red is the Palestinian controlled, Hamas controlled, and the purple is Israeli controlled. So it looks like there's a lot of Hamas in the Gaza City area now. So after this report from the New York Times was published, Netanyahu publicly rejected an offer from Hamas for them to release all the hostages in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners, a ceasefire, and the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. Netanyahu has vowed to continue the slaughter. He said, quote, "In exchange for the release of our hostages, Hamas demands the end of the war, the withdrawal of our forces from Gaza, the release of all the murderers and rapists, and leaving Hamas intact. I reject outright the terms of surrender of the monsters of Hamas," end quote. So rejecting this offer. And, you see stuff from a lot of pro-Israeli people online. They're like, why don't you tell Hamas to release all the hostages, then the war will end? Well, they're saying that they'll do that if the war ends, and it's being rejected by Israel. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu doubles down on opposition to a Palestinian state. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reiterated his opposition to a Palestinian state after holding a phone call with President Biden on Friday, the first conversation between the two leaders in nearly a month. After the phone call, Biden said that the idea of a two-state solution being reached while Netanyahu was still in power was not impossible, and suggested that he might go for an arrangement where the Palestinian state wouldn't have a military. But in subsequent statements, Netanyahu again made clear he was totally opposed to the idea of a Palestinian state. So making Biden look, pretty foolish here. Netanyahu said, quote, "I will not compromise on full Israeli security control over the entire area in the west of Jordan, and this is contrary to a Palestinian state," end quote. So that was on Saturday that he said that. On Sunday, he again reiterated his opposition to a Palestinian state and said, quote, "My insistence is what has prevented over the years the establishment of a Palestinian state that would have constituted an existential danger to Israel," end quote. So he says as long as he's prime minister, no Palestinian state. And that's how he's trying to sell himself, because we know his political career is in peril after October 7th. Israelis want him to step down after the war. It gives him all the incentive in the world to keep it going, to expand it, provoke a huge war. And he's selling himself as the one who can prevent a Palestinian state. And then you have the U.S. officials still, acting like there's a chance that he would agree to something like that. So, all right. The next one here, Israeli troops were told to shoot Israeli captives on October 7th. So this article is from Electronic Intifada, and it is based on a report in Israeli media about the Hannibal Directive. So it's the, I'm forgetting the name of the paper, Yedioth Onroth. It's Ynet is their English language sister site. But they had a big report about how the Israeli military ordered the Hannibal Directive, which means by any means necessary, don't let Hamas take Israelis into Gaza. Don't let them take captives. So I'm just going to read a little of the summary here from Electronic Intifada, and they also have a English language translation of that article that was only published in Hebrew, and it hasn't gotten really any attention from much English language media, but it's a really important story. So anyway, at midday on October 7th, Israel's Supreme Military Command ordered all units to prevent the capture of Israeli citizens at any cost, even by firing on them. The military instructed all its fighting units to perform the Hannibal Directive in practice, although it did so without stating that name explicitly, Israeli journalists revealed last weekend. The revelation came in a new investigative article by Ronen Bergman and Yoav Zitun, two journalists with extensive sources inside Israel's military and intelligence establishment. They also revealed that some 70 vehicles driven by Palestinian fighters returning to Gaza were blown up by Israeli helicopter gunships, drones, or tanks, and many of these vehicles contained Israeli captives. We've seen pictures and videos of burnt out, destroyed, blown up cars that, it didn't look like Hamas had anything that could blow up cars like that. So the journalists wrote that it is not clear at this stage how many of the captives were killed due to the operation of this order to the Air Force that they should prevent return to Gaza at all costs. At least in some of the cases, everyone in the vehicle was killed, the journalists explained. The Hebrew piece has not been translated into English by its publisher, Yedioth Aharonoth. That's the newspaper. I always mess up the pronunciation. But anyway, so Electronic Intifada has a full English version translation. The secretive Hannibal Doctrine is named after an ancient Carthaginian general who poisoned himself rather than be captured alive by the Roman Empire. So this was always a very controversial Israeli practice, kind of a secret order that they had that they kind of claim they didn't do anymore, but only applied to troops, to Israeli troops as far as I know. This is the first time that they applied it to civilians. So it's a huge story. So go check that out. And again, it's very long and detailed, but it's definitely worth a read. All right, so the next one here. At least 16 cemeteries in Gaza have been desecrated by Israeli forces. So this is an article from CNN. Apparently they had reporters in Gaza who saw the Israeli military destroying a cemetery, and this is something that has happened across Gaza, and they've seen video, besides the one cemetery that they saw, they've put together video footage and pictures from people on the ground and matched it with satellite images where they can see the graveyards, the cemeteries before and after they were destroyed and bulldozed. And in some areas, the Israeli military was digging bodies out of the ground. And in at least one case, they claimed that they were looking to see if Israeli hostages were buried there. But if you look at the videos and pictures, I mean, these are like old-looking tombs. Doesn't look like they're fresh graves. And they also, the Israeli military, so they were asked about this, and according to CNN, they didn't have an explanation. They could not account for the destruction of the 16 cemeteries that CNN provided coordinates for, but said the military sometimes has no other choice but to target cemeteries that it claims Hamas uses for military purposes. But that's nonsense because they get in there with bulldozers. So they're like, it's not like they're just launching strikes on the cemeteries. They're in there for a while, destroying them, knocking graves over, digging up, disturbing the bodies. I mean, it's really horrific stuff. And I think it adds to the case that just shows kind of the disdain the Israeli forces have for the Palestinians to do something like that. It definitely adds to the genocide case, which I believe this was cited in South Africa's case. All right, so the next one here. Israel bombs Damascus and kills 5 Iranian Guard members. So this is not good, when it comes to the escalations in the region. This article is from Jason Ditz, and this was on Saturday. Israeli airstrikes in Damascus killed 5 members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, including a pretty senior officer. So if you remember last week, Iran bombed Erbil, Iraq, claiming that they hit a secret Mossad base. That was in response to Israel killing one of their senior IRGC officers in Syria. I believe that happened at the end of November or early December. So that was Iran's response. And then here we have Israel killing 5 of them now. So if you see, the original headline said 4, but it was updated that 5 members of the IRGC was killed. So it's just not, who knows what's going to happen. Earlier on in this thing, it didn't seem like to me like Israel was trying to provoke a full-on war with Iran, but now it seems like they are. And I think because the U.S. would intervene. And I mean, it's pretty clear now that they're really trying to provoke something with what they've been doing in Lebanon, Syria, and then it's just, things are just getting really, really out of control. All right, so the last one here, Ukrainian shelling of Donetsk market kills at least 27. So at least 27 people were killed in a Ukrainian attack on a market on the outskirts of the city of Donetsk in the Russian-controlled portion of the Donetsk Oblast, according to local officials. So that's in the eastern Donbass region. So Denis Pushilin, who's the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, which is the breakaway state that was formed in 2014 in response to the U.S.-backed coup in Kiev, he said 27 civilians were killed in this attack. And they said Ukrainian forces used 152 millimeter and 155 millimeter artillery shells, both types of shells the U.S. has given to Ukraine. I checked the Pentagon's numbers that they put out. They've given Ukraine over 2 million of the 155 millimeter rounds and over 200,000 of the 152 millimeter shells. So there's a good chance that these were U.S. provided weapons in this market attack. The UN strongly condemned the attack. Russia, of course, did as well and said that Western weapons were used, and it said it confirms the West's direct involvement in the conflict. Zelensky did not comment on the attack as of Sunday night. He gave his nightly address, but he didn't mention this. I saw there was one Ukrainian military unit that tried to blame this on Russia, but I think it's pretty clear that the Ukrainians were responsible. There was also Russian strikes in western Donetsk in the Ukrainian-controlled part, and the governor there said that 2 people were killed in 2 separate locations. So the war in Ukraine continues. I mean, I feel like I've definitely been neglecting it because things are just happening so fast in the Middle East and everything. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints, one from Ted Snyder and Nikolai Petro, to end the war in Ukraine, expose its core lie. One from James Carden, the unreality of U.S. foreign policy. One from Jeremy Scahill, Biden wants you to believe that he is opposed to a genocide in Gaza. One from Sheldon Richman, smells like genocide. And one from Gideon Levy, Israel wants a Palestinian intifada in the West Bank. So that's everything for me. I hope everyone had a good weekend. I remember the last episode I said, let's hope, people take it easy on the bombing over the weekend, and that certainly did not happen. So anyway, I'll be back tomorrow. Ways you could help us out: share the show, tell your friends about antiwar.com. All that stuff helps out. Anyway, I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.